Hello, hello. Thank you all for being here tonight. We really appreciate you showing up at 6:30 on a Thursday night to join us. My name is Adriana Ernstberger. I am the chair of the Department of History and Global Studies and the director of the Global Studies Speaker Series. So thank you so much again for being here. I love that we have lots of faces and a diversity of ages in the room tonight. I am going to be brief so we can get to the reason you're actually here. So I'm going to introduce Todd Young, who is our scholar in residence for aging in society with the Scholarly Learning Communities.
Well, if we can get the mic. I'll just use this. Okay, thank you, Adriana. First of all, thank all of you for showing up tonight in what I personally have been looking forward to since the spring, when I actually had an opportunity to talk to Dr. Kor on the phone. So these types of programs would not be possible without the joint cooperation between the Germany on Campus, which is going to be something you're going to be seeing throughout the fall, a number of programs that are being run. Also, the Lugar series, which they run speaker series throughout the year. You will see more of these Lugar series throughout this academic semester as well as into next semester. And then something that's near and dear to my heart, certainly the Scholarly Learning Communities. Now, if you'd like to learn a little bit more on the Scholarly Learning Communities, you can see there is a QR code up on front on the screen, which will in fact take you to the website. What I would like to do is give a brief introduction to our speakers tonight. First, we have originally from Terre Haute, Indiana, Dr. Alex Kor, who is the son of two Holocaust survivors, Michael and Eva Moses Kor. He has a BS in chemistry from Butler University and an MS in exercise physiology from Purdue University. He received his DPN, or Doctor of Podiatric Medicine, from Scholl College of Podiatric Medicine in Chicago. Dr. Kor is a full-time podiatrist for Hendricks Regional Health in Danville, Indiana, and is a clinical assistant professor for Marian University College of Osteopathic Medicine. Knowing the importance of being the son of two Holocaust survivors who have both passed away in the last 5 years, Alex feels an obligation to tell their stories. Since 1985, he has traveled to Auschwitz more than 20 times with his late mother. He is a member of the Candles Holocaust Museum and Education Center Board of Directors and assisted in establishing an exhibit, the Eva Kor from Auschwitz to Indiana, to honor his mother in downtown Indianapolis at the Indiana Historical Society. His new book, co-authored with Graham Honaker, A Blessing, Not a Burden, which chronicles his parents' lives as well as how they positively impacted Dr. Kor, is now available. In fact, you will see those books in the back outside of this room on a table out there. There will be signings of the books after this presentation. Our second speaker, Graham Honaker, joined the Butler Athletics staff in May of 2024 in the role of Associate Athletic Director for Development and NIL Strategy. Honaker's move to athletics came after serving Butler University since 2013 in roles within the advancement department. As Executive Director of Principal Gifts since 2018, Honaker worked closely with athletics and the men's basketball program, in particular on major gifts and the campaign to renovate Hinkle Fieldhouse. He also was the lead fundraiser in Butler's successful $250 million Butler Beyond campaign, which included the $50 million Lacey School of Business and the largest donation in university history, the $25 million gift to name the College of Business after Andre B. Lacey. Honaker's time at Butler also included 5 years as Senior Director of Development. Prior to Butler, Honaker's development experience included his work with the University of Louisville from 2010 to 2013. His work in the community includes stints as the past president of both the Indianapolis Kiwanis Club and Indianapolis Kiwanis Club Foundation, and as a board member with Project 44 and the Milan 54 Hoosiers Museum, among other initiatives. He is the co-author of The Cinderella Strategy, the game plan behind Butler's rise to the prominence, March of 2021, and Unbracketed, 4 college basketball programs and their journeys from the bubble to the big time in 2022. He's also co-author of A Blessing, Not a Burden, 2024. Honaker earned his undergraduate degree from Wake Forest and holds master's degrees from both Indiana University and Louisville. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Graham at this point in time. So Graham, come on up. I'm sorry?
No, I can advance.
All right. Good evening, everybody. How we doing?
Once you get it.
One more time. How we doing? There we go. Can you guys hear me in the back? I always want to make sure I'm speaking to the last person. Okay. Very good. Thank you for having us tonight. This is a real honor for both Alex and I. This book just came out a few months ago, and we've been lecturing really nonstop and have really been looking forward to our appearance tonight here at Marian. This is really Alex's story. It's his family story. My role, I was his co-author on the book. My role here tonight is really to set the stage for how this project came to be. I think it's also important as we talk about the importance of diversity, inclusion, honoring and respecting people's viewpoints. I'm not Jewish, Alex is. We're best friends. I at least like to think that. I don't know if he thinks that about me, but we bring different perspectives to this project. And so I want to give you my perspective and how all this began and my motivations for the book briefly before I turn it over to Alex. Alex and I got connected about 10 years ago. Again, I work at Butler University. I'm on the fundraising side. And when I first started at Butler, I saw in my portfolio of donors a guy by the name of Dr. Alex Kor, who at the time was living in Baltimore, Maryland. I was going to take a trip out to Washington, D.C. to meet with alumni, donors of Butler, and I called upon Alex. And I said, Dr. Kor, could I have dinner with you? I'd love to hear more about your Butler background. And he responded. And as I researched his background, usually I'm looking on LinkedIn and what a person's done with their career, what did they major in, I came across this unbelievable family story, which you're going to hear about tonight, involving Alex, his mother, and his father. Eva Kor, Holocaust survivor. Right away, when I started researching, I was mesmerized by the lectures and her tale of surviving the Auschwitz concentration camp and being a Mengele twin and surviving really the unimaginable. And when Alex and I sat down that night at dinner in Baltimore, we really connected. We developed a great rapport. We had great interest in college athletics and basketball, but we primarily talked about his family, his mother, the Holocaust, and I came to learn that night that his father, Mickey, was also a Holocaust survivor who had survived 3 different camps himself. And toward the end of that conversation, Alex said, you know, my mom has spoken all over the world. And even at that time, she was 79 years old and was still giving more than 100 lectures a year. He said, my mom has spoken everywhere, but she's never spoken at my alma mater, Butler University. And I was floored by this. I'm like, how is this possible? They're from Terre Haute. So I came back to campus and I shared with our president this story and how powerful the Kor family history and message was. And about 2 weeks later, I got an email. And it said, Eva Kor is going to be our honorary degree recipient this year, and she's going to speak at our commencement. I encourage you, if you take anything away from my remarks tonight, if you're looking for motivation and inspiration, go to YouTube and put in Eva Kor 2015 Butler University commencement address. It's one of the great, not only commencement speeches I've ever heard, but but great speeches, period. And at Hinkle Fieldhouse, how many have been to Hinkle Fieldhouse? Okay, pretty fair amount. Great basketball venue. On that day, we had 1,000 young students graduating. We had 9,200 people in the stands. And Eva Kor spoke for about 30 minutes that day. Talked about her incredible journey as a 10-year-old at Auschwitz, ultimately 50 years later to forgiving the Nazis, all the ups and downs and the in-betweens. Throughout that speech, she got multiple standing ovations in Hinkle. But what I really remember was at the end of the speech, she looked our graduates in the eye, many of you whom are here today about the same age as those graduates, and she said, when you go home tonight, I want you to hug your parents. Not just because they paid all this money for you to go to Butler, but when I, quote unquote, graduated from Auschwitz, when the camp was liberated and she was freed, she was looking around for her parents. They were nowhere to be found. They had been executed in the gas chambers. And then she motioned to Alex, who was sitting in the front row, and said, I'd like for my son to come up here and give me a hug. And I still get goosebumps telling that story. From there, Alex and I, our relationship really blossomed, and as our friendship grew, so did our efforts to honor his parents. We endowed a scholarship at Butler in Eva Kor's honor. We collaborated with a good friend of ours named Ted Green, who created a documentary on Eva Kor, Eva A-7063, which I'd also encourage you to watch. And then flash forward to last summer, last August. Alex and I were having dinner, and at one point, Alex said, I really want to write a book. I want to tell my story as the son of 2 Holocaust survivors. And by this time, I'd gotten a bit frustrated with Alex because he had been telling me this for a long, long time. And I said, Alex, you're either going to write the book or you're going to quit talking about it. Now, I had co-authored 2 books in recent years, and I was pretty burned out from the writing process. But this was the one project that I really wanted to take on. And the next day, I sent Alex 20 questions on his life. And he answered those, and here we are tonight. Our book has been published back in May, and we've been very fortunate. It has done very, very well. Before I turn it over to Alex, again, from my perspective, I'm not Jewish. I have many good Jewish friends. My best friend is Jewish. Why was I motivated to do this? Several reasons. Probably like many of you, have become really, really frustrated year after year of seeing hatred, bigotry, racism, discrimination, anti-Semitism rise. Images stick out in my mind. Not too long ago in Carmel, there was a swastika spray painted onto a synagogue. I remember on January 6th when people stormed the Capitol. I still remember this. One of the protesters had a Camp Auschwitz t-shirt, as if he were proud about what had happened at Auschwitz. If we look south, about 2 hours south, down in Paoli, Indiana, lives one of the biggest Holocaust deniers in the country, who led the riots back in Charlottesville back in 2017. So I was very, very angered and frustrated about what I was seeing in the world. And I thought, perhaps maybe this book, in some way, can help. I also was motivated from the standpoint of, I've got 2 young daughters. Hopefully they're studying right now. I don't know what they're doing, but I've been very concerned when I see studies about how little young people know about the Holocaust. There have been really, really terrifying studies showing 16 to 24-year-olds really do not know a lot about the Holocaust, and my hope is that this book, my kids will pass it along to their kids, and so on and so on. Finally, I really wanted to help tell the story beyond just Eva Kor. A lot of people know about Eva's story. You'll hear more about that tonight. But we wanted to tell Mickey Kor's story. Mickey Kor's story, Alex's father, it's an amazing story in its own right. And I wanted to tell Alex's. He's not only a friend, but he's somebody I greatly admire. And as he goes through his presentation, you're going to see that his parents went through the unimaginable, but Alex also went through and still goes through a lot in terms of being discriminated against and the anti-Semitism that he faces. What gives me hope are young people here tonight who I think want to make the world a better place. And my hope is that this book and this presentation helps inspire you as you go out to do that. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to my good friend and my co-author, Dr. Alex Kor.
I got it. I'm good. Good evening. This is an incredible crowd. I want to thank Rachel, Jonathan, Todd. This is amazing, and really appreciate it. So a lot of people ask about the title of the book, Blessing, Not a Burden, and wonder why. So there's a couple reasons why, one of which is when I was 26 years old, I'd finished Butler, I was in medical school, and I was diagnosed with cancer. I joke to people that I have something in common with Lance Armstrong. No, I didn't do PEDs. No, I didn't date Sheryl Crow. No, I didn't win the Tour de France, but we had the same cancer. He was treated here too as well. And so when I heard cancer, I thought, this is probably it. I'm going to die. It had spread to my lung. And so I was in podiatry school, medical school in Chicago, and I kept on crying and crying. And my mom would call me. I would hang up. And so finally she said, look, quit hanging up. Pick up the phone. This was the old days when you have, voicemail recorder. And so I picked up. She goes, look, your dad's a survivor. I'm a survivor. You're going to be a survivor. This is your Auschwitz. So from that point on, that really meant a lot to me. I started thinking, well, she has a point there. My parents overcame something terrible, and hopefully I can overcome something terrible. And really from that point on in my life, I always thought, the old adage, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. I always thought this is kind of my way to not only honor my parents, but to use my parents as an example to overcome adversity. So that's one of the reasons that's the title. And the other big reason, and there are many, but one of the things is that, I feel that I have an obligation to continue my parents' legacy, particularly my mom, but my dad also. And so I think it's really important that one of the things you'll read about in the book is that it's also a call to action. And we didn't talk about it, but obviously from the time we started the book, something terrible happened in the world on October 7th. And for me, as a child of Holocaust survivors, with less and less survivors alive, I kind of think of it as a call to action for me to make sure that these terrible memories are not forgotten. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about my dad's story, then tell you about my mom's story, and then we'll kind of put it all together, and we have some life lessons, and then we have a Q&A. And then we might, if we have extra time, we have a little special surprise. So my dad was born in Riga, Latvia. My dad, like my mom, was from a very religious family. My father had 3 older brothers, and very, very traditional Jewish family, very religious. And 1941, my dad, was no surprise the Nazis invaded. One of his older brother was on a ship. He was part of the Latvian Navy. And Zori was his name. They found out he was Jewish. They killed him and threw him overboard, just like that. My dad's father was walking to work. He was a shoe cobbler. I'm a podiatrist. I had no idea until about 20 years ago that my grandfather was a shoe cobbler. He was on his way to work. They found out he was Jewish. He was dressed in very traditional Jewish garb. At that time, the fall of 41, there were restrictions where Jews could walk and not walk. Can you imagine that in this day and age? And it does sound familiar, doesn't it? But to some extent, he was told where he could walk. He was walking in the wrong place. They killed him. So in a very short period of time, my dad lost his brother and his dad, and then the family was put in a ghetto. A ghetto is not what you think of nowadays, but it was an area with barbed wire, minimal shelter, minimal food. My dad's 2 older brothers were in their early 20s. My dad was a teenager. And his mother, my grandmother, thought, well, let's try to make it somewhat human. They were eating on the ground. And so the last thing she took was an old tablecloth. So when they had Shabbat dinner on Friday night, she put the tablecloth on the ground to have some semblance of being human. They were in a ghetto for a lengthy period of time. At one point, my dad's second oldest brother was on a work detail. He killed a Nazi and escaped, ended up in future Israel. So now my father's with his brother still and his mother, and at one point they're going to liquidate the ghetto. What does that mean? They're going to decide who's going to live and who's going to die. And my dad, even though he was 15, 16 years old, he looked very young for his age. So what they would normally do, they would put older men, stronger men in one area, and elderly and children and women in another. So my dad immediately gravitated to be with his mother, and she knew what was going to happen. She knew that the women, elderly, and children would be killed. She argued with my father. No, you go with your two brothers. You go with your two brothers. No, I want to go with you. Well, my grandmother won out. If she didn't win out, I wouldn't be here. So my father went with his two brothers, and sure enough, on November 30th, and then again on December 7th, 1941, there was a forest, and there was a massacre, the Rumbla Massacre, and that's where my grandmother was killed. This past summer, Grandma and I were there in Riga, and there's a memorial, very, very touching. I had never been there. And so my dad survived because of his mother. If my dad were here now, he would, when he told the story, he would always cry because he had what I believe was survivor's remorse. And so he then went with his brothers. As I said, one of the brothers killed a Nazi and escaped. And then my dad went through multiple camps. He was in Kaiserwald, Stutthof, and then eventually Buchenwald. And during these camps, he was with his brother Leo. And my uncle Leo would tell me years later that he would figure out ways, if you remember the old TV show Hogan's Heroes, where they would have roll call, my uncle would figure out, well, number 1 and 2, they're probably going to go to a work labor camp, so I'll put my brother at 3 and I'll be 5. And somehow he kept my brother and him alive. And they would have work, labor, and sometimes my dad couldn't keep up because he was smaller and not as strong as some of the older men in the group. But my uncle Leo, basically managed to make sure that my dad was not doing a share of the work. He was doing a share of the work. In April of 45, they were on a death march. The war was ending. They could tell that the Nazis were losing the war. And my dad would say, well, he didn't like the Nazis when they were winning the war. He sure as heck didn't like the Nazis when they were losing the war. And so a death march meant that probably they were going to be killed. And my father was with his brother, and we still don't know the conversation that he had with his brother Leo, but at one point he's thinking, well, they're going to kill us. I'm going to make a go for it. I'm going to make it run. So they're going around a ravine, and there's a Nazi there, but there's a little area where he thought, well, I'm going to make a run for it. So he runs. When my dad would tell this story, everything was sports analogies. So at the time when he first started telling the story, the Colts had a running back named Edgerrin James. So he said, I ran like Edgerrin James trying to avoid the bullets. He hid in a building. This is his personal record. Personal record from one of the camps. So he hid in a building, and he was hoping against hope that A, he wouldn't be caught, and B, now there was fighting. The rumor was that the Americans were coming through the area to liberate. Fierce fighting for 2 or 3 hours, gunshots, rockets, and he was just hiding in this building, hoping against hope that nothing bad would happen. He's got lights all over him, his clothes are torn. Then for a couple hours, there's silence. Silence. He doesn't know what's going to happen. But again, in his mind, he's thinking, well, he hears maybe the Americans are coming through. So all of a sudden, he hears a weird language, and he knows it's not German, it's not Hebrew, it's not Latvian. Maybe it's English. So he comes up with his hands up, and it was an American troop led by a gentleman by the name of Lieutenant Colonel Andrew Neff. Lieutenant Colonel Andrew Neff was from Terre Haute, Indiana. Somebody in this room from Terre Haute. So they gave my dad a Coca-Cola. The GIs did. And when I was younger, throughout my dad's entire life, he loved Coca-Cola. When I was a little kid, we had Coca-Cola breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Knew nothing about Pepsi. So they give my dad a Coca-Cola. He didn't know much English, but they asked him, how's it feel to be free? And he said, great. He knew the word free. So eventually, Mr. Neff, the officer, found out about my dad. The initial knee-jerk response by the GIs was that as soon as the officer found out that they would send my dad to a refugee camp. Well, they realized that my father knew the terrain, knew the languages, and their main emphasis of this battalion was to build bridges. So they thought, well, we're going to keep him. So Mr. Neff, pictured here on the left, put my dad in GI clothes, and he was on this Jeep for a couple months. And once they got to a dangerous area, they knew my dad did not know how to use a gun. But by now, he'd befriended Mr. Neff and some of the other GIs. And so they said, Mickey, you don't know how to use a gun. We're going to be in fighting. You gotta go. So my dad looked at Mr. Neff and he said, look, I want to go where you're from. So they put my dad in a refugee camp, and the war now is over. My dad starts writing letters, and somehow he writes a letter that ends up on a doorstep of Mrs. Neff in Terre Haute, Indiana. Mrs. Neff telegrams her husband, he's still in Europe, and says, that little boy you saw, they didn't know how old my dad was, he wants to come to Terre Haute. So Mr. Neff got in touch with the GIs who had liberated my father. They pull him out of the refugee camp, and for several months, my father is with the GIs. This picture on the right is at a bar restaurant in Frankfurt, Germany. If you look up close, it's a Coca-Cola malt. He loved Coca-Cola. And so the GIs took my dad everywhere. They were reading the newspaper Stars and Stripes, and my dad started to learn English. And again, my dad was great with languages. So Mr. Neff and my dad would exchange these letters, and Mr. Neff said, look, you need to learn how to speak English so I can get you into school corporation in Terre Haute. My dad had missed his 4 years of high school, were in 4 years of concentration camp. So the idea was to get him into Terre Haute. So on May 11th, 1946, my dad boards the ship, the SS Marine Flasher, and ends up in New York on May 20th. My dad's name is at the top here, Rockmill Kor. That's the manifesto of the ship. And so my dad eventually ends up in Terre Haute. So my dad, growing up in Riga, Latvia, loved soccer. In 1946-47, there ain't no soccer in Terre Haute, Indiana. There's basketball. My dad, on a good day, was 5'2" or 3. So he ends up in Terre Haute with the Neffs. Everybody loves basketball. My dad doesn't know anything about basketball. So he finishes high school in 1 year, enrolls at Indiana State Teachers College, which became Indiana State University, and he's very excited because he's going to take the gym class, and the gym class is taught by the basketball coach at Indiana State Teachers College. That basketball coach was some guy by the name of John Wooden. Some of you may know him. I know some of the younger people may not. Well, Coach Wooden took a liking to my dad. He would teach my dad hook shots, and halfway through the semester, my dad wanted to be a pharmacist. He pulls my dad aside and says, Mickey, you're a really good student. You're very conscientious. All the younger students, my dad was 20 by now, all the younger students looked up to my dad. So Coach Wynn said, I want you to take the class again. You're getting an A this semester, you're getting an A next semester. Because he wanted to get into pharmacy school at Purdue or Butler. So the following year, Coach Wooden goes to UCLA, obviously becomes the winningest basketball coach, 10 national titles. My dad ends up at Purdue. When I'm a little kid, years later in Terre Haute, we're watching basketball. My dad keeps on saying, there's my gym teacher. I didn't believe him. So Coach Wooden starts writing us letters. I have letters that say, oh, dear Mickey, I have a new player. His name's Lou Alcindor. I think he's going to be pretty good. Lou Alcindor is now Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, for those of you who don't know. And so my dad was very loyal. United States, they gave him a home. So after he finished pharmacy school, he enrolled in the Army. He was in the Korean War. This is in Osaka. One of the things that my dad would say at times, he likes to tell jokes. Both my parents did. They have a great sense of humor. So one day my dad's working at the hospital in Osaka, and he sees a soldier skipping down the hall. And my dad's, soldier, why are you skipping? And the soldier said, well, my doctor told me to take one a day and skip a day. So now there's my dad's, all his whereabouts, various camps, various cities. And so now we're going to talk a little bit about my mom. You probably know her story a little bit better. My mom was from Ports, Romania, Hungary, Romania, in the Transylvanian Valley. My mom, there were two older sisters. Her father, I'm named after Alexander, was very religious. After the two older girls were born, My grandmother got pregnant again. They obviously didn't have ultrasound. So when the midwife came to deliver, he was hoping against hope to have a boy, because in the Jewish faith, it's very important to have a boy. Well, the first baby comes out, Miriam, and with great disappointment, Miriam's born. Then the midwife says, oh, but there's another one coming. With great anticipation, hoping for a boy, out comes my mom. And that was my grandfather's last chance at a boy. And so as my mom would tell the story, she entered this world under very negative thoughts by her father because he wanted a boy. So as her girls were growing up, first 5 or 6 years, anytime anybody did something wrong, my mom was always a black sheep of the family. She always got blamed for things. And so like my father, and one thing you should know, this part of the world was supposed to be saved by the Nazis. By 1941-42, my dad's already in concentration camps. My mom lived a relatively normal life to 1943, early 44. And then in 44, they were put in a ghetto similar to my dad. The entire family was then taken and put in a cattle car. People say they were trains. They weren't really trains. They were old cattle cars. They had a little peephole, and they're put in the car, and the train takes off, cattle car. And periodically, every 6 or 7 hours, the cattle car would stop, and my grandfather was in charge of his cattle car. 100 people stuffed in one cattle car. The bathroom was in the corner, you can imagine. And through the little thing, they would get water, and they would exchange gold watches. So my mom can remember holding her mouth open and having water thrown in, hoping to get a little sip. After 72 hours on this cattle car, the cattle car starts slowing down. And as it's slowing down, they realize that they were in trouble. And all of a sudden, the cattle car opens to mass chaos, screaming, dogs barking. And all of a sudden, she looks around, and her father's gone. Her 2 older sisters are gone. So my mom is now with her aunt holding on their mother's arms on this selection platform. Right in the middle picture, that's the selection platform. My mom thought she landed on Mars. She's 10 years old. She's looking around, scared to death. And all of a sudden, somebody runs up and down the selection platform yelling in German, twins, twins. My mom and my aunt were always dressed identical, always. My grandmother always made sure they looked nice and cute. On this trip, cattle car, they were dressed alike. So a Nazi asked my grandmother, are they twins? Before she could say yes, 3 Nazis jumped out, separate my mom and my aunt from their mother. The last thing my mother remembers is her mother's arms stretched out, screaming and crying. If my mom were here, she would say the one thing she regrets above all, she wished that she knew that was the last time she saw her mother. She never got to say goodbye. And so all of a sudden, family's gone. They're now in a barracks, and they're getting tattooed. My aunt's number was always very clear. My aunt's number was A7064. My mother's number was always what I call smudged. And my mom just thought it was because she was getting older. And then in the 1980s, once my mom and my aunt were comparing notes, and my mom said, Miriam, how come your number's so clear? And my aunt said, Dota Miriam said, well, Eva, don't you remember when the Nazis were tattooing you, it took 5 Nazis because you were kicking, shouting, screaming, and biting. And my mom said, well, I must have blocked that out because we were raised to be good Jewish girls, and good Jewish girls don't bite. That was my mom's first night with my aunt. They go to the barracks. Everybody's twins in their barracks. They were, why are everybody twins? Well, one of the older twins said, well, we're part of medical experimentation by Dr. Joseph Mengele. He uses twins to do tests. One twin, they find out later, one twin is a guinea pig, one is a control. The next morning, all of a sudden, Mengele's announced, and all the twins, ages 3 to 13, these are all girl twins in this barracks, stand like little toy soldiers, and Mengele comes in to survey his new set of subjects. This is a list in the middle on 12 and 13. That's my aunt and my mom. You can see this piece of paper at Auschwitz, Block 6, but they were using medical experimentation. There's still a lot of debate about what the purpose was. If you ask any of the Mengele twins, and I've met over 200 over the years, probably 150, I should say, they all thought that they were being used so that the Germans could perpetuate the German race and have multiple births. If you ask experts nowadays, there's a book that came out 3 or 4 years ago that said, no, Mengel's ways were incorrect, that you really needed to test the mothers, not the children. So during the time, so my mom arrived in Auschwitz in May of 44. By August, September, like my dad, they could kind of notice here and there that the Nazis were losing the war. At one point, if standing in front of her barracks, my mom looks up to a plane and sees a plane circling Auschwitz. She's 10 years old. And one of the things that you need to be aware of is that my mom would tell you the second she landed on the selection platform, she could no longer think like a 10-year-old. She had to think like an adult in order to survive. Survival was guts, but it was also luck. So she looks up in August of 44, sees this plane, and it has an American flag. And when I heard this story when I was in my 20s or 30s, I said, wait a second, how'd you know it was an American plane? She goes, Alex, my dear, they had a cousin, an aunt and a cousin that lived in Cleveland, Ohio. So when my mom was very young, back in Hungary, Romania, they would get letters. My mom was always curious. So she would open up the envelope and see the envelope. It had an American flag as a stamp. She said, oh, that's the same thing I saw on the letter that I would get from my aunt in Cleveland, Ohio. So sure enough, it was an American flag. It was a reconnaissance mission so that they wouldn't bomb inside Auschwitz. Years later, my mom met one of the pilots on that plane. And so, I'm gonna go back here. So late 44 at one point, this is how close, just to give you an example, my mom was to death. In November, December, all of a sudden they wake up, the Nazis are gone. They're not in the guard towers. So the twins were hungry. So they went to the kitchen and they would what they call organized potatoes or steal potatoes. So as they're putting potatoes, my mom, not my aunt, my mom and 2 other twins, not related, 3 single twins, all of a sudden they hear a Jeep pull up. Jeeps weren't the good guys, they were the bad guys. So with potatoes, they turn around, there's 2 Nazis, machine guns. The last thing my mom remembers is a rifle pointed at her head. She wakes up, she thinks she's in heaven. She touches the 2 bodies, they're ice cold. So she realized what happened was she fainted. She fainted and they thought she was dead. The Nazis thought she was dead. So she had to run back to the barracks and tell the 2 twins of the other twins that their sisters were dead. Shortly thereafterwards, they were taken on a death march from Auschwitz II to Auschwitz I. They get to Auschwitz I, it's winter now, this is January, and they run into the barracks just trying to make sure that they wouldn't be killed or shot. So there's fighting in the background, similar to my dad's story, and then all of a sudden on January 27, 1945, they see something in the distance. It's the Red Army, Ukrainian army, coming to liberate. If you know history, the Germans liberated, Americans liberated from the west, Russians liberated from the east. So the twins rush out and they get candy and cookies. This picture on the bottom right, that's why I went back, that's my mom and my aunt at the front. My mom always on the left, my aunt on the right. I've seen the video of this. My mom, to her dying day, liked attention. I'm not afraid to say it. I've seen the video when they started this procession. My mom was in the middle of the line. So I think what happened was she saw the camera and ran to the front to get in front of the camera. It's a video. Well, the funny thing about this video, just so you know, this was actually not taken January 27th. It was much later in February because the Ukrainians came back with motion pictures. My mom thought she wanted to be like Shirley Temple and be a movie star. But that is always known as a liberation picture, but it's actually not January 27th. So after the war, they ended up in an orphanage, which I've been to, and then they ended up in Cluj, which is the bigger city, with an aunt. The aunt had lost family members, my mom, and this is what Graham was talking about. My mom desperately wanted a kiss, a hug. They had gone back to their village, and the only thing that survived was the dog. My mom would tell you the Nazis killed people, but didn't kill dogs. So eventually they're in Cluj, Romania, the bigger city, and an aunt that was there, I think it was my grandfather's sister, my mom just wanted a hug or a kiss, and she said, no, I don't do that. And so eventually they ended up in Israel, 1950, and they were in a kibbutz, similar to a commune, all teenagers now. And I always ask my mom, how did you like living with, they were all Holocaust survivors, all teenagers. And my mom was a typical teenager, and she goes, well, Alex, I learned how to say I love you in 10 languages. She dated a lot, And so at one point, one of the funny stories, then we're in the Israeli army, the IDF. My aunt was a nurse, my mom was a draftswoman. At times, they looked so identical, they would play tricks and switch jobs. So sometimes my mom would be a nurse. I don't know what happened with the patient, but and my aunt would draw buildings. And so one day my mom was dating this guy and she didn't like him. So they would never tell the boy or guy that they had a twin. So the guy comes over and my mom is hiding in the closet. My aunt greets him and he's going to play music on the recorder. So he, of course, tries to kiss my aunt. She slaps him. My mom jumps out of the closet. He ran, has never been seen again. So these are my mom's whereabouts. And so now I'm going to kind of put the story together here. So my dad went to visit his brother Shlomo, the one that had killed a Nazi. He was now in Israel working for a newspaper in the Mahariv. And so my uncle knew his younger brother was coming and knew he was single, so he put an ad in the paper. My mom was getting out of a bad relationship. There was no internet dating in 1960. And so my mom responded to the ad. They went on a couple dates. My dad's Hebrew was terrible. My mom's English was worse. On the third date, my dad asked my mom a question. She said yes. He pulls out a ring. They're engaged. True story. So they had a ceremony in the middle picture in Israel. Some of my cousins are in the picture. They then come to Indiana. My mom was now a sergeant major, so it took a couple of months for her to get out of the army. So my mom then came to Terre Haute. So you can just think, my mom went from Transylvania to Tel Aviv to Terre Haute. And so 2 years later, I was born. 2 years later, my sister was born. We were Packer fans. I'm pulling for the Colts this weekend. But, for the most part, it was kind of a normal childhood, except we would go to Israel every couple of years, and I would see all the relatives with numbers, and I, realized that there was a past. And on the same token, we knew everything that had happened to our parents. And just to give you one story, I was 7 years old and my sister was 5. And we were used to seeing my mom's number when she did the dishes or cooked, because it was always on her left arm. So my sister's at the neighbor's house, Mrs. Baker, and playing with their daughter. And so my sister says, well, Mrs. Baker, not Jewish, not a Holocaust, where's your number? My mommy has a number here. Well, Mrs. Baker, very smart, said, well, Rena, you need to go ask your mom that. The house is very close together, Park Street. We have a friend in here who lived around the corner from me. Sorry? Excuse me. So my sister went home, or next door. Mommy, Mrs. Baker, I don't understand. She doesn't have a number like you. One of the things my mom, and to some extent my dad, but mainly my mom did, she would tell us in very age-appropriate terms the answer. And I think that's very important. So my mom said, look, Rena, remember your dad and I told you and your brother that bad people did bad things to us. And one of those bad things, they put a number in my arm. Oh, and Mrs. Baker didn't have those bad things. Right. So at the age of 5, she understood there was a difference with our parents versus the average parent in Terre Haute. And so one of the things that happened, which kind of defined some of our family, is when I was in fifth grade, during Halloween, kids would throw corn at the house, then run to the next house. Well, this seems like a pretty benign act, and it is. But my mom, when this happened, her images and thoughts reverted back to the 40s when she was, 5, 6, 7, 8 years old. And so the next day she would hide behind the tree and chase these kids. This is in Terre Haute, Indiana, 1972, 73. The next day, things escalate. We have toilet paper in the house. The next day, I remember coming home from a PTA meeting. There's swastikas on the house, go home, dirty Jew. I didn't know what a dirty Jew was. And so there were a lot of trials and tribulations over the years, one of which was in the middle picture top. She was arrested at the Capitol Rotunda. That was kind of a defining moment. But one of the things that we want to talk about, among other things, is that I think that, it's very important that people understand nowadays that particularly if you have some connection to the Holocaust, and even if you don't, like Graham doesn't, he's not Jewish, I think it's important to understand what can happen when people say things and do things. And so, let me just go here. So let me go back to one thing I want to mention here. So in 1985, this bottom picture in the middle, my mom organized a reunion of twins at Auschwitz. That was 1985. That was the first time I was there. I was 24 years old. The weird thing for me was that I had never been to Auschwitz. I had never read a history book because my history book were my parents. But I knew where everything was, and I was kind of charged with logistics, trying to help the twins. These are all Mangala twins. And so this picture on the left is my mom and my aunt, my mom on the left. And for the most part, that was the first time, and I think I've been to Auschwitz. I'm going again in January. I think it'll be 30 times. And so as time went on, my mom, became more and more active. And one of the things was that this is before she died, but she was working on a speech. She wanted to give a speech at the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, which was January of 2020. Unfortunately, she passed away before that, but you can see somewhat, unfortunately, how prophetic she was regarding what happened afterwards. So I'm going to kind of finish up here. There's a couple other things I want to talk about, but these are just some life lessons. My father, sometimes it was more humorous, but he was a tough person. He passed away over a longer period of time. I was working with him in Lebanon, and he was with me the last year and a half up there. And so these are some of the things that my mom's life lessons. I'm going to talk about forgiveness, and then we're going to open up for Q&A here shortly in a couple minutes. So in 1993, my aunt was, in 1987, my aunt was going into kidney failure. And so my mom didn't want my aunt to go on dialysis, so my mom flew to Israel and donated her kidney to my aunt. And when they took the kidney out of my aunt's body, it had not developed beyond the age of 10, which is when the experiments were done. This hospital in Jerusalem had done thousands and thousands and thousands of transplants. Transplant went well. Both my mom and my aunt were good. A couple years later, my aunt started developing urinary tract polyps. One became cancerous. Eventually it spread. They were part of the National Health Service there. So once they have a certain grade, certain stage of cancer, they give up on the patient. Dr. Einhorn, who treated me for cancer, which I talked about at the beginning, brought my aunt here, I should say, and for about a year, gave her an extra year of life with chemotherapy. So anyway, my mom was, June of 1993, my mom came home from a real estate showing, gets a voicemail on her answering machine. I'm sorry to tell you, but your sister just died. So my aunt died. My cousins in Israel, very religious, so they buried her that day. My mom would cry and say, I never was able to bury a family member. And so my mom would always, one of the things I've learned from my mom is no matter how tough it was, she would find a way to pull herself off the mat and do something productive. So for a couple of months, she was sad and still doing her work in real estate, lecturing here and there. And then in the fall of that year, 1993, she gets a strange phone call. And the phone call was, well, Eva, I want to invite you to lecture to doctors in Boston. And my mom said, I love lecturing to doctors. Oh, but there's one more thing. Maybe you could find one of those Nazi doctors to bring to the meeting. And my mom, like I told you earlier, liked to joke. And she said, well, Dr. Mihalchik, where would I find one of those dudes? The last time I looked, they were not advertising in the yellow pages. That's exactly what she said. Oh, Eva, you'll think of something. And she remembered that the last project that my mom and my aunt worked on was for ZDF, which is a German PBS network in Germany. And in the final production of the documentary, there was a Nazi doctor who was cleared of all charges. His name was Hans Mooch. So my mom wrote the ZDF and said, look, I really need to get in touch with Dr. Mooch because I've been tasked to see if I can get him to come to a meeting. They gave him Dr. Mooch's number. So finally had a family member, a friend who spoke German, and they called my mom and said, well, we have good news and bad news. The good news is he'll give you an interview. The bad news is he's not coming to Boston. You got to come to Germany. So my mom had not been back to Germany, and this was going to be very difficult. So there was a TV crew, and So she flew to Dr. Munch's house. Let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Munch. He was cleared of all charges because he refused to do selections. He was, in 1938-39, and this is why I've actually lectured in this room before, he was in medical school. And he was very driven to be a medical student, and so they said, well, if you're going to continue your medical studies, you need to join the Nazi Party. He had a lot of Jewish friends, didn't believe in a lot of the ideology of the Nazis, but he joined the Nazi Party, attended meetings, finished medical school, practiced medicine, and in 1943 they closed his practice. He was part of the Mental Hygiene Institute. He was not considered an Auschwitz doctor, but he worked at Auschwitz. And that was a little bit of a loophole for him because he didn't do selections, and he actually saved about 20 Jewish doctors. So when his trial came up in 1947 in Krakow, he was the only Nazi doctor that was not either sent to jail or killed. He went back to Germany, practiced medicine. So he meets my mom, and my mom at this point was already thinking ahead. She wanted to have other twins avoid the same predicament as her, meaning maybe Dr. Munch knew what was injected into them because he worked somewhat alongside Mengele. That was my mom's purpose. So when she met with Munch, with great disappointment, Dr. Munch said, look, Mengele kept everything to himself. He didn't tell us anything. And my mom was really disappointed. Then he said something strange. He goes, but I have nightmares. And my mom said, wait, you have nightmares too? He said, of course. So he goes on to describe the workings of the gas chamber. Periodically, he would have to sit outside the gas chamber, and when all the bodies stopped moving, he would sign one death certificate. He went on to describe the operation of the gas chamber. My mom said, Dr. Munch, the world needs to know this. Would you come with us to Auschwitz in 1995, January 27th, to tell the world to document this? And he said, of course, I'll come. So my mom came back. I wasn't on that trip. She came back to Terre Haute, thrilled because she was going to have a Nazi doctor that would document what had happened at Auschwitz. Because then, as well as now, we all know there's revisionists. People say that, oh, it didn't happen, or it wasn't that many, or the Mengele experiments. Recently, forget her name, Candace Owens said it really wasn't that bad. They didn't really mutilate bodies. So here my mom had this doctor that was going to testify and document on all this. So my mom wanted to thank him. She wanted to figure out a way to thank him. She went to the local Hallmark store at Middle Shopping Center, 25th Street, looking for a Hallmark card for a Nazi doctor. Eva, what are you looking for? And she was too embarrassed to say, I'm looking for a thank you card for a Nazi. 2 hours later, she left. Went to the local liquor store. My parents didn't drink much. Nothing seemed appropriate. Then one day, she was cooking, shopping, cooking, and one day she thought, oh, I'll write him a simple letter of forgiveness. From me, the Mengele twin who was trying to survive, to this almighty Nazi doctor, it's the highest honor I could pay him, in my name only. And she would stress this, in my name only. So she went to her local professor. My mom got her degree at Indiana State and wanted to make sure English on this document was correct. And the professor said, oh, it's document's perfect, but really you were forgiving the wrong guy. Well, no, I need to forgive Munch. I want to thank him. Well, you need to think about this because really you should probably forgive Mengele. No, I want to forgive Dr. Munch. So on January 27th, Dr. Munch said his piece, told us, he documented the Holocaust, showed remorse, even though there was no deal made. Some people say there was a deal made. There was no deal made between Dr. Munch. He had no idea my mom was going to do this. So then my mom read her statement, and from that point on, she no longer had this chip on her shoulder. I remember a reporter asking, well, so you've forgiven Dr. Munch, would you forgive Mengele? And my mom said, well, I'll think about it. But over the next several months in 1995, she would smile more. And so by the summer of 95, 96, she started talking about forgiving Mengele. She didn't want to just forgive, she forgave her parents because she resented her parents because they were supposed to keep her safe. She wanted to forgive herself for hating her parents. And so she became a big, obviously, proponent of forgiveness. I'm going to fly through these here. So one thing, we're almost done here, and this is usually where I cry, so I get my little distraction, the water bottle. And so if you've seen the movie that Graham mentioned, at the end of the movie, Eva A-7063, my mom is on the selection platform looking up at the heavens, and to her mom, she says, Mom, I will tell your story. I hope you're proud of me. Sorry. So today, I say, Mom, Dad, Grandma, Grandpa, I hope you're proud of me. I will tell your story. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, both of you. We'd like to leave some time for questions. Do we have any questions from the audience?
I'll start off.
Okay.
I am curious, Alex, because obviously your mother in 1995 started this whole process of forgiveness. Where was your father on that camp of forgiveness? Was he ever able to let go of that?
So initially, no. There were arguments at the dinner table, and then gradually, he didn't want to lecture at the beginning either. So he started lecturing, 1997, 98, and he would get this question a lot. He would say, "No, that's Eva's thing." And then my dad was a big NBA fan, big basketball fan, mainly Purdue, and football fan. His favorite player was Dirk Nowitzki, Dallas Mavericks. Dirk Nowitzki is of German descent. So one day, he calls me up. I was living on the East Coast. He goes, "Well, I'm going to call a press conference." Okay, what are you going to talk about? "Well, I'm going to symbolically forgive Dirk Nowitzki." I said, "Dad, but we don't know if he..." No, it's a symbolic gesture, because I'm starting to understand Mom's forgiveness, and I want to let him know because he's my favorite player. So he had a press conference to his dying day. He had Dirk Nowitzki's jersey in his room. I still have it. I emailed Mark Cuban, the owner. Back then, I didn't get a response. Recently, I got a response about something else. But then years later, after my mom died, we have a family friend who's an attorney in Germany, helped my mom with some of her things over there. He contacted me and said, "Well, there's a Stutthof guard." I always forget his name. I'll think of it in a second.
Wasn't it Bruno Day?
Bruno Day, DUI, Stutthof guard that was on trial. My dad would have been the same age, and he was probably there, and they were asking for testimony for people that were at Stutthof. So my dad was in a nursing home, but pretty with it. And so I said, "Dad, we want to know if you want to make a comment." "Well, let me think about it." So a couple days later, a family friend and I go back, and I had no idea what he was going to say. The family friend's writing everything down. He says, "Well, in my wife's honor and memory, I'm going to forgive Mr. Day." I was shocked. That was right 2020, right before the pandemic. And so we sent that statement to Germany, and it was read in court. And so I think at the end, he did forgive. Just as an aside, a lot of the Mengele twins didn't like my mom's forgiveness. My mom went to Israel once in the same village as my aunt. There was another Mengele twin. He was on antidepressants. He was a mess, drinking. And my mom said, "Maybe you should think about forgiveness." Within a couple years, he stopped drinking, got off the meds, started lecturing about forgiveness, took kids to Auschwitz, and lived the last several years of his life much healthier. So I've probably answered too much there, but thank you.
Quite interesting.
Thanks. Any other questions? Oh, you're going to mean easy audience.
Run back here.
Oh, my neighbor from Terre Haute, we rode bikes together. He was a really good baseball pitcher. I think he struck me out when I was a 10-year-old, but go ahead, Dave.
You got a better memory.
No, you were a good pitcher.
We were talking several weeks ago, and I asked you, well, let me preface this. I think, after talking to Dr. Kor, I witnessed Eva's first lecture
Yes.
at our elementary school. I was in sixth grade, and I remember her coming to give the talk. And I remember her pulling up her sleeve and showing everyone her tattoos. So when we were together here several weeks ago, I asked Alex, I said, "What did your mom think of tattoos? So prevalent nowadays. And if you would, could you tell a little bit about that story?"
It's great to have somebody in the audience that can lead me. It's perfect. So my mom didn't like tattoos at all. One thing you should know is my dad didn't have a tattoo. Only people that went through Auschwitz did. So my dad he never had a tattoo. So my mom didn't like tattoos, and as tattoos became more and more popular among kids, my sister doesn't have one, I don't have one. one day she was lecturing at Terre Haute North, and she had in her mind that all kids with tattoos were drug addicts. And so one day she was walking to her auditorium, and there were 3 kids that had tattoos, 3 boys, and as my mom said, their pants were cleaning the floor, and they had long hair, tattoo, earrings, everything. And so one of them dropped a pencil, and my mom said he had the audacity to bend over and pick it up. I saw things I've never seen before. So she said, but with those 3 boys there, they must be drug addicts. And they said, well, Eva, they're our valedictorians. Really? So my mom would then tell kids, look, I too, Eva, am prejudiced. I'm prejudiced against people with long hair, tattoos, earrings, everything. I too need to learn not to look at somebody and treat them by their character, their actions, etc. So I think, Dave, where you're going, which we cover this in the book, is in 2017, my mom was a Grand Marshal in E500, and we're on the red carpet. Jake Gyllenhaal, which some of you know, is like all the cameras are on him, and we were going the wrong way on the red carpet. It was my fault. So out comes this guy, about 6'1", tattoos, earrings, everything, and he goes, hey, baby, let's take a picture. And he's got sunglasses on. I can't see him. So now all the cameras are on this big guy and my mom, and she looks at me. I go, and so there's a picture of me. Actually, I have the same sport coat. And so I'm behind her. I look like I'm working security. And so they're all taking pictures, and she's kind of looking and not sure, so she smiles. And then he looks at me and he goes, hey, man, take good care of her. So we go up to watch the race, and about an hour later on the Indy 500 website, they say, only at the Indy 500 would you have Holocaust survivor Eva Kor and Nikki Sixx from Motley Crue. So when I was a kid, my parents didn't let us go to concerts because everybody at concert did drugs. And so we never went to one concert. So I'm telling my mom, he was the reason. I mean, he was one of the guys. Oh, he's a nice boy. He's a nice guy. So my mom was on Twitter. She still has 33,000 Twitter followers. And so later we were leaving. She goes, I'm gonna send him a tweet. Dear Mr. Sixx, it was nice to meet you on the red carpet. How can I become a rock star like you? So Nikki, who I keep in touch with, responded later, well, Eva, my dear, you've been a rock star your whole life. And so my mom would text people. I couldn't keep track. I had my own life. And so a couple of months later, I said, Mom, she was having shoulder problems. I said, Mom, how's your shoulder? She goes, oh, Alex, it's doing so much better. Nikki's been sending me CBD oil. It works great. And so that summer, she was starting to slow down, and I said, Mom, we really need to limit your activity. Well, I'm flying to California. I'm going to be on Nikki's show, and I really need to help him because he needs to forgive himself with the drugs he did, and blah, blah, blah. I said, okay. But then I'm going to be on this other thing, BuzzFeed. And I go, Mom, why are you doing this? It's a waste of your time. No, I'm going to do it. Leave me alone. So she goes out there, and Ted Green was filming the movie. It's in the movie. So the BuzzFeed thing, which I made fun of, I believe 240 million people have seen the video. And so the tattoo story, I don't have tattoos, but my mom definitely didn't like them either. So thanks, Dave, for the prompt. Any other questions? Maybe somebody wants to quiz Graham. Yes.
Over here. I think these mics are working. Working? All right. So I'm a father of a 10-year-old and a 5-year-old. And so thinking about your mom and aunt at 10 years old being pulled away from a parent, and then you describing your sister at 5 understanding the difference in the marking that your mom had. Graham, I do have a question for you. You mentioned that you're a father also. And I wonder...
I'm not. I'm still single, still Jewish, still looking. He's a father. But
Graham,
go ahead.
I wonder, so knowing your background in development and writing about athletics, as you were experiencing this new writing project, how did it influence the way you discuss contemporary issues of hate, violence, prejudice, anti-Semitism all across the board? How did that come into your family as a father?
Yeah, that's a great question. This really hits home because last night I was trying to tuck my kids into bed, even though my older one's like, just let me go to bed. But I went in there last night and she said, Dad, this week we did a drill on shootings in our school. And I could tell she was visibly shaken up. And she goes, is this going to keep happening? She asked me about the gun laws and all these things happening. And I think one of the things I realize is my kids know a lot more than I think they may know. And there are times when we were writing this story and, the book has, we'll talk about this as we conclude. The book doesn't go into really, I would say, the graphic details of what happened in the Holocaust. But my kids, they see these things, they see images. And so what I've tried to do with Alex's family story and framing the book to them are the lessons to take from it. I mean, they've gotten to know about Alex's parents, and we talk about, like Alex said, is how you treat other people. You treat them based on their character. We talk about hate a lot because they're seeing it a lot in the world. They're too young still to go into details about, say, the Mengele experiments and some of the complexities around the Holocaust. But what I have also realized is that shielding them entirely from this is a mistake. I mean, again, you do have to think about the age. If you have a 4-year-old, they're probably pretty young to do that. But at the end of our book, we talk about life lessons. We could have taken about 50 lessons from his parents that anyone could apply. We drilled it down to 8. Those are 8 lessons that I've gone over with my kids. So while they may not, I'll try to wrap this up, while they may not know everything that happened going back to the Holocaust, how are the lessons from this book, from inspirational stories that hopefully they can apply to their lives and maybe to their children's lives someday? But again, I would say they know a lot more than I think they know.
Any other questions? Because I'm going to end on a positive note. So one of the things... Oh, I'm sorry. Yes.
Yeah, I was going, so I bet you have some wonderful memories with your parents. Would you be willing to share 1 or 2 just fun memories that you have with your parents?
Oh, perfect. You guys are just prompting me exactly what I need. So both my parents had this incredible sense of humor. And in the book, you'll read about it. When I lecture a lot, when I lecture particularly a Jewish audience for Holocaust remembrance, they said, well, it's a very solemn occasion. I said, believe me, I know. My mom lost 119 family members. My dad lost over 80. But I think their humor really got them through life. And so in 1995, just to give you a couple anecdotal stories, 1995, we have Dr. Mooch on the bus. We're at Auschwitz. We have 2 groups of 50. And during January 27th, which all the dignitaries in the world are there, and security is very tight. So we're at the Auschwitz gate. They won't let us in. And we have a whole itinerary. So my mom gets off the bus, and I knew where this was going, pulls up the arm, and I was outside, and she says, look, where's your pass? She goes, I don't need a pass. There's my pass. She goes, look, 50 years ago, you wouldn't let me out. Now you won't let me in. Gates open right up. So that was, my mom had a lot in Hebrew chutzpah. So a lot of, and then my dad, most people would think he was always quiet, which he was. He would tell you, I don't talk about the Holocaust. Once you got him talking, you couldn't get him to stop. And he would say, well, it's like a faucet. Once you turn the faucet on, the emotions would just run out. He couldn't stop the emotions. So just to give you, and I don't mean, and when we talk about humor with the Holocaust, I think it's a very sensitive subject because by no means am I diminishing what happened, the 6 million, the 11 million, believe me. But this is a funny story. So my father lectured at the museum. He always wore his Purdue hat and a Purdue sweatshirt. Never wore a suit and tie, never. And so I'll tell you 2 stories about that. So one time this lady comes from the Lafayette area. And she says, oh, you're a Purdue grad. And my dad says, yep, 1952 pharmacy grad. And she says, oh, my son, he works at Purdue. And my dad said, professor, and she doesn't answer. So my dad gave the lecture, and he would always finish this lecture by playing the piano. You can see him on YouTube playing the piano. God Bless America, Schindler's List, If I Were a Rich Man. And if he got the audience crying, that was his litmus test. He had done his job. So sure enough, these ladies cry, and lady says, I'll be back in a couple weeks. He doesn't know her name. So she comes back a couple weeks later with a big box. And my dad says, oh, yeah, your son, he's a professor at Purdue. And she goes, well, he works in the athletic department, but he wants to give you a gift. My dad says, Ticketmaster? She goes, open the box. Beautiful basketball to Mickey Eva from Coach Matt Painter, Matt Painter's mom. So one other story. So one time my dad was lecturing with a Purdue hat. And this little boy, 10, 11 years old, raises his hand and he says, well, Mr. Kor, you have the worst luck in the world. Well, why is that? Well, you were a Jew in Germany during World War II, and you're a Purdue fan in the state of Indiana.
We've got time for one last question.
Yes.
Talk a lot about your mother and how she was saved because she and her sister were twins and they were valuable for medical purposes. How did your dad manage to escape, or how did he manage to?
Well, Graham's brilliance in writing the book, I mean, he was beyond lucky. There were multiple times where he should have been dead. I mean, it was one thing after another. I mentioned my Uncle Leo figuring out a way, the death march, the fact, I mean, it was so much luck. And the percentage of survivors from Stutthof is minimal, even less from Buchenwald. He was just lucky. I mean, it was pure luck and being in the right place at the right time. And that's a great question. But he was obviously not a twin, but he had somebody looking over him.
Just make one closing comment. Our hope is that you really enjoy the book, and if you do enjoy it, hope you pass it along. But in terms of two reasons we hope you'll read the book, number one is the inspiration. I mean, these are really unbelievable stories that his parents, their lives led. Little inside baseball, even though this is being recorded, where we have a hope that this book actually might become a motion picture. And their stories, you don't need to have a grand script written about it. It really is like a Hollywood movie. But if you're down on your luck, you're having hard times, I certainly did when I was young and when I was in college, this book is really a source of inspiration of how to try to persevere and overcome adversity. And then the second reason is none of us can really relate to what it was like being a Holocaust survivor. But with his mom's story of forgiveness, which, as a reminder, took her 50 years to forgive, didn't happen overnight, all of us can relate to somebody in our lives that we're trying to forgive. And I think if you read his mom's life, before her forgiveness and after it, you would see a great difference. And I can tell you myself, her example moved me to forgive someone who I had not talked to in a long time. And think about that if you're looking for a reason to read it or to pass it along to someone. But we're really honored that we got to spend some time with you tonight. And thank you so much.
Thank you.